there's only so much you can do to replicate a real game. You're never going to fully get that, but doing everything we can to kind of replicate that.
The Indiana Fever's Media Day drew more than 30 members of the press, a number that, even a few years ago, would have been unimaginable for this franchise. The turnout reflects how dramatically the team's national profile has shifted. What was once a rebuilding program drawing modest attention is now a subject of sustained, serious scrutiny. Cameras were positioned throughout the practice facility. Rookies moved through the room with the deliberate composure of players who understand that everything they say will be replayed and analyzed. The atmosphere was not typical of a preseason media event. It carried the weight of genuine expectation. That level of attention is both a consequence of and a pressure on the team's current moment. The Fever have assembled a roster with real star power, legitimate depth questions, and a financial structure that will begin to show its limitations within the next 12 months. None of those tensions were hidden during Media Day. They surfaced, clearly and repeatedly, in almost every significant conversation. The most substantive tactical discussion to emerge from Media Day centered on how the Fever intend to manage the physical demands placed on their most dynamic player. The issue is not abstract. Running full-court pressure night after night, absorbing defensive attention from the opening possession, navigating traps and double teams before the offense even sets, produces measurable wear. By late in a long season, that wear shows up in the shooting data. The coaching staff has been examining how to distribute that burden differently. The conversation during Media Day was not speculative. It was grounded in what the team observed across the previous season, particularly in the closing stretch, when efficiency numbers declined in ways consistent with cumulative fatigue rather than individual off nights. The approach being considered is not about reducing the star player's role. It is about repositioning that role at specific points in the game, keeping her influence intact while reducing the physical cost of maintaining it. Coaches and analysts who have studied how elite offenses manage star players over a full season will recognize the logic. The question is whether the supporting cast can absorb the responsibility that comes with that shift. Viewers who watched last year's coverage closely picked up on this discussion and largely responded to it with measured approval. The off-ball framing was seen as a realistic acknowledgement of physical limits rather than a strategic demotion. That reading is correct. The adjustment, if implemented consistently, is a form of roster management that extends rather than diminishes what the team's best player can contribute. What makes the conversation more complicated is the degree to which the rest of the lineup must respond. Moving a primary ball handler off the ball only works if the players replacing those creation responsibilities can do so reliably. That is the real variable. The talent exists on this roster to make it work. Whether it translates into execution, particularly in late-game situations when defensive adjustments tighten, remains to be seen. Behind the on-court discussions, the Fever's front office is managing a financial structure that is increasingly difficult to navigate. Several players on the current roster are approaching or have already reached the performance thresholds that trigger significant salary escalations under the league's existing collective bargaining framework. This is not a new problem in professional sports, but it is a particularly acute one in the WNBA, where salary cap space is limited and roster flexibility is difficult to preserve across multiple contract cycles. When players perform at an all-WNBA level, their market value rises faster than most teams can accommodate within their existing cap structures. The practical consequence is that the Fever cannot simply retain every player who earns a pay increase. Decisions will need to be made. Some of those decisions may result in departures that the organization would otherwise prefer to avoid. The front office is operating with a compressed timeline, assembling a competitive team now, while knowing that the cost of maintaining it will rise steeply in the near term. Several veteran players on the roster signed one-year contracts rather than longer-term agreements. That pattern reflects both the players' desire for flexibility in a market where their value is rising, and the team's reluctance to commit to salaries that may not fit under the cap in subsequent seasons. The result is a roster that looks cohesive on paper, but carries meaningful uncertainty about its composition. 12 months from now. Sophie Cunningham addressed this directly during Media Day. Reports had circulated beforehand suggesting that she was frustrated with her current contract situation. When asked about it, she declined to confirm the specifics while making clear that the discussion around player compensation in the WNBA is legitimate and overdue. She framed her response as a call for honesty in how the league and its teams discuss money publicly, rather than as a personal grievance. The distinction is meaningful. Cunningham positioned herself as someone arguing for structural transparency. not someone airing a private dispute. Whether that framing holds through the season will depend on how her contract situation resolves. For now, the conversation she opened is one that applies across the league. Players at the top of their market are navigating salary structures that do not fully reflect the commercial value they generate for their teams and for the league as a whole. One of the more revealing moments of the offseason involved Myisha Hines-Allen, who had approximately 48 hours to decide on joining the Fever. The timeline reflects the compressed nature of WNBA roster construction. Unlike leagues where negotiations can extend over weeks or months, transactions in women's basketball often require immediate commitments from both sides. Hines-Allen made her decision and arrived with the kind of profile that adds real versatility to the Fever's forward rotation. Her ability to score at multiple levels and rebound in traffic gives the coaching staff options they did not have in the same combination previously. Viewers who commented on her addition generally responded positively. She was seen as a player who could make the roster more complete rather than simply more prominent. The speed of her decision also underscores something important about how the Fever are perceived around the league right now. Players of Hines-Allen's caliber do not agree to quick commitments at organizations they doubt. Her willingness to decide rapidly signals something about where the Fever stand in terms of their competitive credibility among free agents, which, given the franchise's recent history, is a meaningful development. What remains to be established is how she fits into the rotation structure over the course of a full season. Her strengths are clear. How the coaching staff integrates them with the team's existing offensive and defensive frameworks is the practical question. Early indications from training camp were positive, but the sample is small and the competition level will rise sharply once the regular season begins. Much of the discussion about the Fever's defensive identity this season centers on Raven Johnson, the young guard whose college career was defined by her disruption in passing lanes and her activity in help side positions. The WNBA poses different challenges than the college game. Opposing guards are faster, more decisive, and more capable of punishing over-aggressive positioning. But the skills Johnson developed at the college level translate in ways that matter. Her feet are rarely stationary, her hands are consistently active, she reads offensive flow quickly and makes decisions about where to apply pressure before the ball moves. These are characteristics that coaches can develop incrementally but rarely install from scratch. Johnson arrived with them already functional. The question being evaluated during training camp and into the early season is whether those skills hold up against the best guards in the league. Disrupting a play in college is a different exercise than contesting an elite scorer who has spent years refining their technique against world-class defenders. The Fever are asking Johnson to be a primary defensive anchor in the backcourt, a role that would limit the defensive burden on the team's higher usage offensive players and allow the off-ball adjustments being planned for the rest of the lineup to function as designed. If Johnson can fulfill that role consistently, the entire defensive structure of the team becomes more coherent. If she cannot, if the elite scorers she faces in the Eastern Conference repeatedly expose gaps in her technique or physical preparation, the rest of the defensive scheme becomes harder to sustain. The coaching staff has expressed confidence in her development. That confidence will be tested in real time starting in the opening weeks of the season. Commenters who watched the media day coverage picked up on Johnson's presence and tended to respond favorably. The framing around her was not about hype, but about a specific functional role, an enforcer in the backcourt who does the work that makes the stars more effective. That kind of role is understood and appreciated by fans who watch basketball closely, and the coverage struck that balance well. One of the more statistically unusual features of the current Indiana Fever roster is the presence of 4 sets of twins: Lexi Hull and her twin, Kelsey Mitchell and her twin, and 2 additional pairs who joined the organization during this offseason cycle have produced a roster composition that is, by any measure, historically uncommon. People tracking professional sports rosters have begun checking historical records to determine whether any team in the major women's or men's leagues has ever had this many twin siblings simultaneously rostered. No confirmed precedent has surfaced. Whether this represents a meaningful pattern or a statistical coincidence without deeper significance is a matter the front office has not addressed formally. What it does signal, if anything, is that the Fever's scouting approach during this period has converged on a particular type of player across multiple positions, players who come from high-performance athletic backgrounds, who have spent their careers competing against someone at a similar developmental level, and who have track records in shared competitive environments. Whether that background translates into any advantage on the court is speculative. but the coincidence itself is a legitimate data point in understanding how this roster was assembled. Viewers found the Twins phenomenon genuinely interesting, and a proposed concept, a Twins versus Twins game format, drew significant attention in the comments section. The concept is entertaining precisely because it does not require any suspension of basketball logic. The players are real, the dynamics are real, and the visual premise of organized twin matchups within a professional context is novel enough to generate sustained curiosity. Whether or not such a format would ever be officially organized, the discussion itself reflects how this roster's composition has captured public attention in ways that go beyond conventional basketball analysis. Several coaches and players across the league, including members of the Fever organization, have raised concerns about officiating consistency over the past 2 seasons. The issue surfaced again during Media Day, not in the form of specific accusations, but as a structural complaint that has become increasingly common in league discussions. The core problem, as described by those raising it, is variability. When the standard for what constitutes a foul shifts between referees, between games, or between halves of the same game, teams cannot build reliable defensive systems. A defense constructed around specific rules of engagement becomes ineffective when those rules are applied inconsistently. Coaches spend time preparing for officiating tendencies the way they prepare for opponent tendencies, and when those tendencies are unpredictable, the preparation becomes unreliable. The league has acknowledged the concern and has convened internal discussions about how officiating can be made more consistent. What form any adjustments will take, and when they might be implemented, has not been made public. For teams like the Fever, who are building a defensive identity that depends on controlled physicality and precise positioning, the officiating environment is not a secondary issue. It shapes how the game is actually played, and it affects outcomes in ways that do not appear in the box score. Among viewers who engaged with the team's Media Day coverage, there was a recurring observation about how information was being presented, specifically about how the transitions between topics could be handled more effectively. The complaint was constructive rather than dismissive. The content itself was seen as substantive and well-researched, but the movement from one subject to the next sometimes felt abrupt rather than connected. This is a real tension in sports media coverage, particularly during Media Day, when topics arrive quickly and are often unrelated to each other. A reporter or analyst moves from a contract discussion to a tactical question to a roster curiosity without the natural connective tissue that a longer feature would provide. The viewer notices the seams. The underlying suggestion that structured transitions would make the coverage feel more coherent is a valid production note. It also points to a broader challenge in how the Fever's story is being told this season. The individual elements are compelling: the financial pressure, the tactical shifts, the new personnel, the statistical anomalies. What holds them together is a coherent argument about what kind of team the Fever are becoming, and what will determine whether that process succeeds or stalls. That argument exists, but it needs to be made more explicitly and more consistently across coverage. The organization itself can help with this by being clearer in its own public communication about the priorities and the logic connecting them. When players and coaches are asked about unrelated topics in rapid succession, they have limited ability to contextualize their answers within a larger narrative. That work falls to analysts, reporters, and the editorial choices made in presenting the coverage. The viewers who raised this concern were identifying something real. Related to the transition concern is a more specific observation about the offensive playbook and how it has been discussed publicly. The Fever's system this season appears to be more layered than in previous years, incorporating the off-ball adjustments described earlier, new personnel with different skill profiles, and defensive responsibilities that require guards to function in positions they have not always occupied. Explaining this kind of complexity in a Media Day format is genuinely difficult. The questions being asked by reporters are not always sequenced in a way that allows coaches or players to build a coherent picture of how the pieces connect. The result is that individual answers are informative in isolation, but do not accumulate into a complete understanding of the system. Some viewers noted that while the tactical content being discussed was substantive, the organization of ideas, particularly around how the playbook strategies interact with personnel decisions, was not always clear. That observation is fair. The Fever system as currently constructed has real sophistication, but sophistication requires clear explanation to be understood, and the Media Day format does not always create space for that. What would help? both in coverage and in the team's own communication, is a more deliberate effort to explain the connective logic, why specific personnel decisions were made in the context of the system being built, how the defensive assignments relate to the offensive adjustments, and what the team's own benchmarks are for determining whether the adjustments are working. That level of transparency would serve both fans trying to understand what they are watching and analysts trying to evaluate whether the team's decisions are sound. The Indiana Fever entered this season with more organizational complexity than at any point in recent memory. The roster is older and more expensive. The competitive expectations are higher. The financial window during which this particular group of players can be kept together is not indefinitely open. The league is paying attention in ways it was not 2 years ago. None of this is unfamiliar territory in professional sports. Teams that build quickly often find that the cost of maintaining that build exceeds what the financial structure allows. Managing that process, retaining the core while absorbing the inevitable departures, developing the younger players who will eventually need to take on larger roles, maintaining competitive performance while making hard decisions about personnel, is what separates organizations that sustain success from those that peak and contract. The Fever's front office is aware of these dynamics. The one-year contracts, the careful handling of the salary escalation framework, the deliberate approach to how new personnel were integrated. These are not accidents. They reflect an organization trying to compete now while preserving its ability to make decisions in the future. Whether that approach produces a deep playoff run this season depends on factors that were not fully visible during Media Day. The health of the roster over a long season, the development of younger players like Raven Johnson, the degree to which the off-ball adjustments for the team's primary offensive player translate into wins rather than just efficiency numbers, the consistency of officiating environments across venues, all of these will shape the outcome. What was visible during Media Day is that this team understands its situation with unusual clarity. The players speaking publicly were not performing optimism. They were articulating specific concerns, making specific commitments, and acknowledging specific uncertainties in ways that suggested a locker room that has thought seriously about what this season requires. That is not a guarantee of success. Teams with clear-eyed rosters fail for reasons beyond self-awareness, but it is a better foundation than the alternative. The Indiana Fever's Media Day was, ultimately, a compressed version of the questions the entire season will answer at a slower pace. Can the off-ball adjustments for the team's primary player actually reduce fatigue without reducing effectiveness? Can Raven Johnson develop into the defensive anchor the coaching staff needs her to be? Can Myisha Hines-Allen's addition create the kind of interior versatility that makes the Fever harder to defend? Can the front office navigate the salary escalation problem without losing a player whose departure significantly weakens the team? These questions do not have answers in April. They will be answered gradually and sometimes painfully across 80-plus games and however many playoff games follow. What the Media Day established is that the franchise is taking them seriously. The attention 30-plus journalists, national cameras, sustained analytical interest reflects an organization that has earned scrutiny by becoming genuinely competitive. The scrutiny itself is now part of the environment these players will operate in every day. The Fever of 3 years ago did not have that problem. The Fever of this season do. The difference between those two situations is, by most measures, progress. Whether the organization has developed the depth and sophistication to sustain that progress is the question that this season exists to answer.